Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I've got Peter Salmon back again, author of the book about the post-structuralist philosopher named Derrida called An Event Perhaps. Check out that book. And we first got connected over your article in Prospect magazine. There's a book there, An Event Perhaps. Check that out. And I have the link for the Amazon page to buy that in the description of this video, like I did last time. And we first got connected over that article that you sent me on Twitter that you wrote for Prospect magazine about, I think it's called something like how Derrida and Foucault became the most misunderstood philosophers of our time. And our first podcast was about how a lot of public intellectuals like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson are misrepresenting postmodernism. And we talked about Husserl the last time. And so I thought it would be interesting and fun to talk about the relation between Heidegger and Husserl both as people and their influences on each other in terms of their ideas, along with Nietzsche as well, and Heidegger's thoughts on some of Nietzsche's ideas, and also, like I was saying before we started, in terms of them as people, how you were getting into before how Husserl was influenced by Heidegger, but then Heidegger ended up kind of betraying him because he was a supporter of the Nazi Party during World War II. And then that's a little bit of a similarity with Nietzsche because he was not a Nazi supporter at all, but his sister, after his death, heavily edited his work to sound as favorable as possible to Hitler so that he could use this kind of like screwed up document in some of his speeches. So, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that we can get into because you were talking before about how Husserl invented the field of philosophy called phenomenology, and Heidegger has some interesting thoughts on ontology, like his difference between capital B being and lowercase being, and his distinction between the ontic and the ontological. And he also talked about some of Nietzsche's ideas, like he criticized Nietzsche's death of God. And then Nietzsche talked about ontology and phenomenology as well. So there's some interesting kind of similarities and differences and crossovers here. So I guess to start off with, do you want to just give a kind of a bit of a review of what phenomenology is and Heidegger's influence on Husserl?
Yeah, absolutely. First thing to say, of course, is that Nietzsche predates the other thinkers by 30 or 40 years. So
Nietzsche came way before. Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
And he, in the sense that he talked about phenomenology, he would have been using it as a much more loose term, as used by someone like Hegel and so forth. So it was a word within philosophy when Nietzsche was writing, but it came to prominence by Edmund Husserl. Husserl had what I think is a brilliant idea, and he thought it was a brilliant idea, and a whole bunch of the continental philosophers have thought this is a brilliant idea, which is to essentially put aside the question of whether the world exists. It's an interesting question, and philosophers are free to look at it if they wish to. But if we put that aside, he called it bracketing it. If we bracket the idea of whether it exists, what philosophy should be doing, he thought, was actually describing how the world affects us, our experience of it. So philosophy becomes a descriptive act. So it's not, does the moon exist? But when I look at the moon, what's going on? What do I see? What do I feel? What is the phenomenon doing? Immanuel Kant had made this distinction between noumen and phenomenon, noumen being the actual world itself, the real, which we actually have no access to, according to Kant and according to Husserl as well. If you take a table, I have visual stuff from it. I might have taste stuff from it if I wish to, smell, so forth. But I can't actually know that there's a table there. There could be a small dog. I don't know. But if everyone agrees there's a table there, that's as close as we can get. That's the table. So essentially what Husserl is saying is forget about the actual table and or small dog, whatever's there. Let's just talk about how it affects us. And phenomenology, therefore, was kind of describing the world, describing how we feel about the world. So there's certainly, poetry and poetics and that sort of area, relationships, comes under phenomenology, but just the very basic stuff like how is time experienced. He's not interested in objective time, if we want to call it that. The time of clocks. He's interested a bit, but what he mainly wants to do is look at how we experience time, how we feel about time. So he looks at things like duration, the passing of time. Is there a separation between consciousness and time? Maybe consciousness is just time. Our temporal experience of the world is simply what time is. So he's interested in that. And spawns a whole raft of very, very interesting thinkers, I think. And one of whom was Martin Heidegger. Heidegger is his student, and also he's kind of assistant and helps edit some of his books and writes forwards for some books and all of those sort of things. Fairly standard practice within the philosophical circles that someone would do that. And for certainly the first few years of their relationship, they were very, very close. And Husserl, in a sense, saw Heidegger as the person who was going to take his project forward the most. Heidegger was obviously brilliant, in many, many ways, and would turn out to be a very brilliant philosopher. So their initial interactions were very, very positive. And that all started to go a bit wrong in the 1920s for both philosophical and personal reasons, which I can just dive straight into if you'd like me to. Or
sure.
Yeah. So well, let's start with the philosophical. Heidegger took the idea of phenomenology, and actually let's go back to Husserl for 1 second. One of the things that Husserl had noticed was you're stuck in traditional philosophy with the mind-body problem that Descartes had identified or had spoken of, trying to work out how the mind and body interact. And they obviously do. And Husserl was worried by the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, which is the establishing point of much modern philosophy. Husserl, under the influence of a man called Brentano, a thinker called Brentano, had identified that we don't just think, we think about things. So we immediately have a relationship to the world. We think about a table, we think about a friend, we think about things. So there's an aboutness in which Descartes hadn't identified. So Descartes, you can have a model of a brain in a jar. According to Descartes, that is a feasible thing. There wouldn't be any difference in the thinking of that brain in a jar to my thinking. Husserl said that's obviously not the case, and a lot of people like Merleau-Ponty and French philosophers have taken up this thought. So he was really trying to focus on consciousness and the way we examine the world. And he sort of thought that once we start doing philosophy, we think about the world in a different way. So whereas I would just encounter a table, when I do philosophy, I'm doing a scientific exploration of my thinking about it. So that was kind of one of his jumping off points. Heidegger then wanted to take this further. Heidegger is saying, well, not only is it, once you do philosophy, you're thinking about things in a different way, but that's actually not how we interact with the world. And Heidegger, in a sense, thought consciousness was overstated. He thought a lot of our interactions with the world aren't actually conscious interactions. So to take one example, if you're approaching a door, which has a doorknob, and you want to go through that door, if you're being strictly philosophical, you would experience your body walking up to the door, you would see the door, you would match it against other doors that you've experienced in your life and identify that it's a door. You would then identify that it has a doorknob. You would know somehow that the doorknob is turnable. You would put your hand out and you would experience putting your hand out, turn the doorknob, open the door. Notice now there's a hole there, so you can go through that hole and then close the door, and so on and so forth. So essentially he's saying that that's how, if we're being strictly philosophical in the way people have been philosophical in the past, that's how we would go through a door. That's not how we go through a door, obviously. We walk up, we don't even think of it. We're thinking about something else. Heidegger's prime example is the hammer. If you're using a hammer, banging in nails, as long as you're doing it and it's all going very successfully, you don't think about the hammer. The hammer is just in your hand. Another example is when you're driving a car, you're not constantly aware of all the steering wheel, of the wheels, of what you're doing. It becomes part of your body. Heidegger was trying to move even further than Husserl by saying, we actually inhabit the world in that way. And when we're doing philosophy, that is really very different to how we experience the world.
That's just to add there, that gets into his Heidegger's distinction between the ontic and the ontological, and his Dasein rather, or capital B being, because like as you were kind of illuminating in your examples, um, when we when we're examining what exists and human experience, we can't escape our own perception as a human, as a thinking thing. Like, we can't escape our consciousness. It's like, you know, how some people say, if you're a fish in water, you don't know that you're in water because you only exist in water, so you don't know that you're existing inside it. So you can't escape examining things from your own conscious mind. And then, like, similar to what you were saying too, when we do philosophy, Heidegger talked about it like a science, because it's like we're doing this kind of like rationalistic exercise, and it's very different from the way we live our lives, just like instinctually. Like, we can't escape the way that we exist in the world, right?
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. So to go to the hammer, when do you think of it as a hammer? You think of it when you miss the nail or you hit your finger or something like that. It becomes the hammer again. And the distinction you're talking about is he made one between ready to hand, and present at hand. These are obviously the English translations. So when we're using the hammer, it's ready to hand, and that's actually how we experience the world, as ready to hand. It's there for us. When we hit our finger or get angry at the hammer or miss the nail or whatever, we then experience it as present at hand, as just an object in the world. And for Heidegger, that second way of experiencing the hammer is how philosophy has tended to deal with the world. And this is where we get into ontology. So Heidegger makes this distinction between the ontological and the ontic. Now, that second example, when I'm thinking of the hammer as an object, it's an ontic thing. So he says philosophy has tended to look at hammers, concepts, other people, as objects in the world. Now, when we're having this conversation here, I'm not experiencing you as an object in the world, you know, forgetting the fact that we're on Zoom, but, you know, you're a person with whom I communicate, we see each other's faces, we have a, you know, and I'm never thinking, well, there's that object sitting there in that room. But he's saying that philosophy has really struggled to not, philosophy would be saying, how do I understand that object that's over there, that Andrew object? How do I understand that? So this was the distinction that Heidegger was making between the ontic, bunch of objects that we're amongst, and the ontological, which is actually how we experience the world. And you mentioned his word Dasein, which means being here, basically, or being there. It's, being here is probably closer. So you are almost a sort of hole in the universe that moves through things. You are a point of being. And he thought that the actual being, with a capital B, and in fact it's the first words of being and time, the question of the meaning of being has been forgotten. So he puts this right back to Plato. He says as soon as Plato starts to do philosophy, then actually then philosophy breaks free from how we actually live our lives. And there's a slightly sort of mythical element to it, which we'll come back to when we get to Nazism, where there's this kind of golden age before we did all this stupid philosophy and thinking, all this consciousness stuff, where we just were in the world. And actually, most of us still do that on a daily basis. Those of us who aren't having conversations like this about philosophy, mostly we're just in the world. In fact, one of his phrases is being in the world. That's how we exist. And also, we're thrown into this world. And that's another key Heidegger term. We're thrown into a time and a place. You know, it's the whole. Partially, that's the whole series of coincidences that have happened for you and me to be talking, right from, you know, sperm and egg, through to me being asked to write the book, through to you doing a podcast, through to you reading an article, all of those coincidences and so forth. So we're thrown into a time and a place, and we're rooted to that place in some sense. And the world we then interact with all around us in lots of, you know, fascinating or boring ways. So Heidegger was doing phenomenology to an extent. He wanted to see what was going on in a human at all times, but a bit less about what's going on in the human mind and a bit more about what's going on in the human interactions with the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously, you mentioned Heidegger's being in time. Time was an interesting thing that he focused on too when you mentioned Husserl. So that was perhaps one of their kind of similarities too. What is the difference between how Husserl and Heidegger look at the concept of time?
I think they're actually, I find them quite similar in that area. I mean, I think again, Husserl, it tends to be a lot more about the mind and consciousness. He wants to really think about how we experience time. The example he uses, he has this idea of there's no, the present moment is made up of both stuff that's come before, he calls that retention, and stuff that's going to happen in a second afterwards, he calls protension. And the example he uses, and I think it's a very good one, is when you're listening to a piece of music. If you listen to a single note, you're affected by the note that came before that, and you're anticipating the note that came after that. So you don't hear every note in a piece of music as a completely discrete entity existing by itself. It's part of a tune. And that's how Husserl described the way that we exist in the world, that we're constantly, going forward through time, and we're constantly carrying everything along with us. Derrida picked out some holes in that, but we won't do that now, perhaps. For Heidegger, again, it's much less about consciousness, and it's much more about how we exist fully as humans within time. And spoiler alert, being in time is basically saying being is time. So we are an expression of time. But we're also a finite being in theory, infinite time. And he finds that interesting, his concept of being towards death. So we die, okay, unless one of us turns out to be exceptional, then like everyone else in history, we're going to die. Now that affects at every single moment what it is to be a human being. Okay, we would be doing very different things all the time if we knew we weren't going to die.
Yeah, like if we were vampires and lived forever.
Exactly.
We look at the world differently, right?
Yeah, exactly. We'd look at the world differently. So yeah, so there's a banal point that we go and try and do a million things, and we jump off bridges, and we do Groundhog Day sort of shit. But there's also just a very fundamental thing. Yes, we would. All of human consciousness would be different. One of the major things about human consciousness is it's finite and it's going to die, and there's a passage of life. So that's one of the other ways in which time is a huge thing for Heidegger, that we are a finite being, and we are a constantly finite being interacting with a whole lot of other finite beings. There's some interesting stuff I was reading recently about, often when we think about interacting and our place in the world, we think about spatial stuff. I'm here and particularly in terms of other human beings. But the other weird thing about other human beings is you have a select group who you are going to do this journey with at the same time as, some of whom will die before you, some of whom will die after you, some of whom were present at your birth and thought, isn't that amazing? Some of whom will mourn your death, some of whom may be happy at your death, all of those things. So there's this kind of group of people who go right through the world with us. So that's much more sort of Heidegger, again, trying to get it away from consciousness and getting it back into the world as he saw it.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm kind of familiar with some of Heidegger's criticisms of Nietzsche. Like, he was critical of Nietzsche's famous death of God, the old gods are dead and we have killed them, in which I think he was actually kind of prophetic in saying that the role of that religion plays in society is decreasing, and it's going to be replaced by something else. And you could certainly see evidence of that in how political tribalism has, or at least seems to have, increased a lot. Actually, I was going to ask you what Husserl thought about Nietzsche, because I'm not familiar with that. But what do you think about that in terms of Heidegger's thoughts on Nietzsche?
Yeah, I'm absolutely unfamiliar with how Husserl thought about Nietzsche. I don't know that he ever met him. I mean, I think one of the things about Heidegger is Heidegger, in a sense, brings Nietzsche back into the conversation. I mean, I think Nietzsche had kind of faded away. Well, I mean, or if he'd ever been part of it, obviously he sold like 3 books during his entire lifetime, and basically most of his books were written in a frenzy in the last few years before he went completely mad. So I don't think that Nietzsche was a major philosopher when Heidegger approached him. And I think it's a really interesting sort of conversation between Heidegger and Nietzsche. The first thing I want to say about sort of the death of God thing, which of course has become what Nietzsche's famous for in some sense, apart from what does not kill me makes me stronger, which I think Nietzsche would be utterly appalled by the fact that has become a popular phrase, and particularly how it's the worst thing Nietzsche could imagine happening to his work. But the death of God, I mean, there's a couple of things to unpack there. One is that in a sense, Nietzsche was just stating that we can have no certainties about of an afterlife. Again, in a similar way to Heidegger, we're a finite being. So, but he also had a sort of stronger take on that. It's very easy to see Nietzsche as just an iconoclast, as someone who's tearing down everything. And I often fall for that trap myself. And then you read him again, and the first thing to say is he's the best writer of all the philosophers. He's just glorious, even when he's being nuts. He's absolutely
he's easy to understand, like way easier to understand than Heidegger and Husserl, for example, and many others, right?
Yeah, he's funny, he's irreverent, he's constantly turning things on their head, and his insults are just absolutely brilliant. But one of his kind of main antagonists, in a sense, was Christ. Now, when I say antagonist, I don't mean to defeat. I mean someone he grappled with throughout his life. I mean, his father was a pastor. Nietzsche's problem wasn't necessarily with Christianity, although it was as well. But he thought that...
like his book, The Antichrist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But he was equally sort of hard on all religions, mostly because they were failing in what they said they would do. For him, the problem with Christianity was not Christ or Christ's teachings. The problem was it wasn't being lived as that. As soon as you started throwing words at Christianity, and particularly in some of those particularly right-wing versions of Christianity going around at the moment, what Christ would think of them is unbelievable. But what Christ would think of, a pope in a palace, or so many of the things that have been done in his name. Nietzsche was basically saying this isn't Christianity. Christianity is this, is that. Christianity, apart from anything else, should be problematic. If you actually read the Gospels, it's weird stuff. It's parables, and it's strange, and it's odd, and all of those things. And Nietzsche's saying, what God is dead because we're not doing what God does. If you read the Bible, it's batshit crazy and challenging.
It's difficult, especially like some of the apocalyptic literature, like the Book of Revelations, where there's like a sword coming out of Jesus's mouth and there's a three-headed dragon and stuff like that.
Yeah. But also, I mean, just the stuff where God contradicts himself, as it were. We'll call him for now, but God will suddenly be completely unjust. Job, he punishes for no reason. Suddenly he'll change his mind about something. Now, what Nietzsche is saying is this is actually incredibly insightful about the way that we encounter the world. We do encounter it as unjust sometimes. It is arbitrary, it is contradictory, it is confusing. And the problem has become that Christianity and Judaism and any other religion, they smooth over those contradictions. They try and make nice with it, as it were. And he was saying, death of God, we don't fear the world in the way that God should make us fear the world. We don't extend charity in the way that Christ said we should extend charity. So all the death of God stuff is all very much picked up in that as well.
That's interesting, because like the way, but like obviously people totally misinterpret his famous the death of God thing a lot, and like the way you describe, the way they misinterpret it often makes him sound like the most militant atheist possible. But like at least his motivation behind those sorts of things, it almost sounds like it's coming from a Christian motivation, like you're not being Christian enough. Like it reminds me of Martin Luther's inspiration for eventually kind of starting the Protestant Reformation, because he thought, all these religious people and all the things they've told me to do, they're not allowing me to experience religious revelations enough. So we need to change the church, because all this corruption is preventing me and others from having these religious revelations. So it sounds like a really similar motivation.
Yeah, I think that there are similarities there. I mean, Nietzsche did tend towards the hyperbolic, so you have to be a bit careful.
Yeah, for sure.
Tend towards the heroic. So he did he want? He maybe wanted a world where it was all big clashes, Wagnerian gods fighting and people expressing their passions every time, and maybe he wanted that. But what he was definitely saying was that's not how the world is now. Humans have been made smaller and smaller and smaller, and more, stuff like he has this great riffs about history, that we're just obsessed with history at the moment. I actually posted something on Twitter the other day about one of his spiels, which it's very like Twitter. He just says everyone has an opinion, everyone's talking, there's endless talking, and we're supposed to learn this stuff. We have to learn and learn and learn and learn and then talk more and stuff like that. What about just being? Why don't we be? What's the best way to learn? By doing something, by turning off everything and thinking and experiencing the world. And what he says then is, when you do that, it's not the nicey human. You parts of you are nice human, but parts of you are jealous, parts of you are angry, parts of you are this, and that anger isn't just the yelling on Twitter, in the language of Twitter, or it is the passions that you have for life. And he thought we'd lost the passions for life, and he did blame Christianity for this. He thought that it had taken a meek version of humans and put that forward. Now, that may or may not be a good thing, but for Nietzsche, it was not a good thing.
That's one of that reminds me of one aspect of Nietzsche that I like, that he kind of seems to share with the post-structuralist philosophers who we like Derrida and Foucault and people like that. Like, one of the things that I enjoy that they do is criticize kind of scientism and this Enlightenment era overemphasis on the importance of rationalism and the demonization of the passions. It's kind of like this dualistic mindset all throughout Western philosophy. Then you can go back even farther than Descartes for that too. Like, the intellect and the mind is superior than the body and the passions, and this whole idea that pervades that realm of thought.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nietzsche was kind of one of the first philosophers, if not the first philosopher, to sort of say, well, rationalism is just a type of being in the world. It's a type of dealing with the world. It has its valid aspects, although I'm not sure whether Nietzsche ever said that, but it does have its validity. But it's not the only way of being in the world. It may not even be the best way of being in the world, but certainly not the only way. And it is a different thing to how we actually do interact with the world, which comes back to what we were saying about Heidegger, that actually we don't do rational. And, one of the things that's interesting in the world at the moment, and, slightly terrifying as far as I'm concerned, is that we are learning more and more that rationalism and politics are separating, and a whole bunch of stuff's being unleashed. Now, I suspect Nietzsche wouldn't have minded that. So, not being a wishy-washy liberal like me, so he enjoyed that sort of stuff. But he did feel that we'd separated ourselves from our actual core being. Now, this of course brings us to Nazism. If you want to go there now.
Yeah, sure. I just want to add before you go there, you were talking about Twitter. I bet Nietzsche would troll people on Twitter just for fun.
Yeah,
I bet he would be one of those types of people.
He had some real resentment, and also, I mean, the best aphorisms, and of course, aphorism is the precursor to Twitter. He could destroy you in 140 characters.
Yeah,
very, very easily.
that one of his books called I forget what the actual book is, but the subtitle is something like "Philosophy with a Hammer," where it's all these short maxims that are meant to be like takedown things. Those are perfect for tweets.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, what does not kill me makes me stronger is one of those.
Yeah.
But he was doing that with a serious purpose, because I read this about Derrida, that the way a person writes in philosophy also expresses their philosophy in some sense, and for Nietzsche, again, there's this whole problem that if you write academically or you write very long arguments, then you're doing exactly what he says is the problem. You are it's better for him to actually be able to go, bang, this is what I think, this is the moment of inspiration, and I unfortunately I don't read German, but if you speak to someone who does, these are incredibly concentrated little poems, as it were, these aphorisms that he writes. They're incredibly complicated and brilliantly done. Many see him as one of the great German writers, forgetting what the genre is, forgetting its philosophy. He is one of the great writers, and when you read him in English, you do get that impression as well, for sure.
Especially if you look at his book, Thus spoke Zarathustra, because it's like a parable. It's not. It's nothing. It's not like a regular philosophy book at all.
No, and it's highly confusing, and it's one of those books
Yeah.
where I feel like I got a glimpse of what he's going on about. But he's doing what he says that religion should be doing and no longer does. That speaking in riddles, speaking in parables, hinting at stuff, and having a hero's journey, as it were. So Zarathustra is a very confusing book, and I would recommend you don't start there if you haven't read any Nietzsche, because you'll just go, "What is this shit?"
Yeah.
But something like The Antichrist is just a wonderfully witty, easy to follow, beautiful piece of writing. And it is going, I have one person who's, worthy of my discussion. I'm going to get into a dialogue with Christ. So let's have it out, you, me, and Christ, which does give a bit of an idea of how Nietzsche saw himself, of course. But he turns out he wasn't far wrong, much to everyone's surprise.
Yeah.
So,
There you could say there's some similarities there, and maybe delusions of grandeur, which maybe contributed to him literally going insane at the end of his life.
I mean, he's a really interesting case psychologically. I'm always slightly resistant to over psychologizing people, because I think explain everything. But Nietzsche, his books, he was a very, very intelligent man. Obviously, he became a professor at 18 or 19, something ridiculous. It might have been 22 or something, but it's still ridiculous age of philology. But basically, his ideas drifted from the mainstream. His books didn't sell. He lost his university job. He's obviously having thoughts that are, well, he calls them untimely, out of time. They didn't fit into that time. They would fit much more readily now, partially because we've had Nietzsche. So he was in a world of his own to a great extent. When you read any reports of interactions with him, I mean, he did slowly withdraw because of illness and because of migraines and all sorts of stuff. But everyone who spoke of him said he was lovely. He was delightful and shy and quiet, and the politest man at the dinner party. So he'd be incredibly polite at the dinner party and go home and write this extraordinary stuff about overthrowing all of society and the overman, and competing with God and stuff like that. But because he was not within society, and he did go mad. And some of his later works, it's incredibly interesting where the madness starts and where the philosophy starts and where the division between them. And I think for a long time it was just seen as the ravings of a lunatic, and because it was so against normal philosophy and against normal thinking. And I think he must have been incredibly lonely, and once he goes mad, tragically, he then sort of spends, I think it's about 10 years in an asylum. There's some haunting pictures of him in there, gone. There was nothing left, basically. So yeah, incredibly fascinating figure. But he churned out 4 or 5 of the books in the last 2 years of his sanity, and they're just extraordinary pieces of writing, and incredibly challenging to any reader, to anyone who wants to read him closely. Yeah, but that brings us to Nazis, of course.
Yeah.
It always must happen. So, I said there were sort of 2 reasons for Husserl and Heidegger falling out, and this was the big one, was Nazism, basically. So let's go with Husserl. Husserl was Jewish, born Jewish, but when he was in his early 20s, I think it was, maybe late 20s, got married and converted, and he and his wife both converted at the same time. Both Jewish backgrounds, converted at the same time to Protestantism, basically, so-called, and then lived the next 40 odd years of his life, 40, 50 years of his life, as a highly esteemed philosopher. Invents this new school, as it were. He's a professor. He has everything that goes with being a professor, has acolytes, and he saw himself as a very integrated Western European intellectual. And I don't think in any way he's kind of acknowledged his Judaism at all, not because he disliked it, but that was what you became. And Martin Heidegger becomes his student and all that stuff. And then, of course, Hitler gets into power. And Hitler is not interested in distinctions about what you've converted to and your academic career and how it's all gone. Husserl is now Jewish, and his wife is Jewish, and he is there's no way around that. The university gradually withdraws support, ends up sacking him. He has to move home because that's requisitioned. And these are shattering events in his life. It's hard to underestimate how shattering they would have been. And, basically, had he not died early in the war, he would have ended up in Auschwitz. Almost certainly. It's hard to see how, unless someone got him out of there. And for someone whose entire life was built on a certain image of themselves, for this to happen, it destroyed him. But the sort of icing on the cake, as it were, or even a fair bit of the cake, was Heidegger. Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. He gave a sort of notorious speech about, pro-Hitler speech, because he took over Husserl's chair when Husserl was kicked out. Heidegger takes over.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So basically, he's nudged Husserl out. When Husserl dies, Heidegger says he had a cold and couldn't go to the funeral. I mean, he's a shit. There's anyone who reads anything about Heidegger, if we're getting back to biography, Heidegger's just a shitty little man, I think, in many, many ways.
No wonder he looks so angry in all his pictures.
Yeah. There's a great passage in The Existentialist Cafe by Sarah Bakewell, where she's looking at existentialism, which also flows out of Heidegger. And Paul Celan went to visit Heidegger. This is also very complicated. This is after the war. Celan's Jewish, a whole bunch of stuff about that. And Heidegger went to the local bookshop and put all of Celan's books in the window. And Sarah Bakewell says, I'm including this anecdote because it's the only time in my entire research of Heidegger I've read about him doing anything nice. And I think that's very nice.
Wow.
So he does all of this. And, there's obviously huge repercussions for Husserl emotionally, psychologically, philosophically. What do we do with this information about Heidegger? I mean, certainly part of him doing that is accidental. I mean, he's alive at that time. You go with the flow. Who amongst us can say we wouldn't have done so, et cetera, et cetera? It's all very good to say, yes, I would have resisted, of course. So part of it's accidental. Part of it's not, of course, in the sense that, this was a time where the West was seen as being in decline. There's books like Decline of the West by Spengler. World War I has happened. And I think it's easy to forget because we just see World War I as a historical fact, how awful that was for everyone. People were killing each other on a scale that had never been experienced before. If you're living in the world in the 20s and 30s, you've experienced that in a massive sense. The world had gone mad in many ways. Mm-hmm. Heidegger's philosophy,
and like it was the first war where people could use technology to kill on a mass scale bigger than they ever could before in history, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And civilians were no longer outside of those targets. They were still much more than they ended up being in World War II, but you still had great civilian casualties. So it was if we went to a world war right now, people like us would be going, what is going on? What's going on with humans? Humans have gone mad. They're killing each other for, obviously we do have those thoughts about certain things now anyway, but, at that time, for the intellectual class, and I'm sure lots of others, but for an intellectual like Husserl or Heidegger, the world has gone mad at this point. It's in decline. It's barbarity again. And part of Heidegger's philosophical argument, of course, is that, yes, we do have this terrible mistake going on in the world. We need to get back to where we were before. So in a way, Heidegger's ideas align with this whole rebirth of the world. Unfortunately, the horse he backed was Hitler. Hitler's idea of the rebirth of the world was different to Heidegger's in many ways, but there's analogies, and it's very hard when you're trying to unpack these. And Derrida and other things have tried to do this, to unpack which bits are the Nazi bits and which bits aren't. And it's very hard. Heidegger after the war writes a lot about poetry, but talks about the return to the earth. We have to get back to our roots, which again isn't so far from Hitler with Blood and Soil. And Heidegger talks about the worker, and the glorious worker, and working with their tools and stuff. Hitler again, it was National Socialism. So there's that. But the final thing to say about it, I guess, is that what makes it really bad is Heidegger doesn't apologize. After the war, he gives at least one very major newspaper interview, which wasn't published until after his death. He fails to apologize. He gets a bee in his bonnet. That's putting it lightly, about technology. About the technology, and he says, look at Soviet Russia. The Gulag system. They're killing people. It's all machine stuff. It's all technology. Da da da. He doesn't mention the 6 million Jews who've been killed in the Holocaust. He just glosses over that. So he's never repentant in any sense. There's a couple of personal anecdotes about him apologizing to people like Hannah Arendt and stuff, but he never actually has the bollocks to say, wasn't that really shit? So that's why it's very hard, therefore, to shake off the Nazi associations of Heidegger. And as brilliant as Heidegger is, there is always that very uncomfortable sort of communication between him and that particular way of thinking, which privileges the German spirit, which privileges, the rebirth of the soul and all of those things, and ignores the consequences of that.
Yeah, I guess I'm not I'm not that familiar with like, as you were saying, like the similarities and differences between Heidegger's thought and Hitler's, like in terms of Hitler's thoughts on those sorts of ideas. I mean, I guess the only thing I've read about that is I read Mein Kampf, which is a very educational book about like a leader's descent into madness, basically. But yeah. I guess I don't really think about that very much, and it'd be interesting to see more of those similarities, because, like you said, he is in spite of being an awful person, he is a very interesting thinker too.
Absolutely.
That's yeah.
I mean, it's an incredibly fine line to take something like, the idea of, so Heidegger's kind of saying that we're rooted to place, where we come from is we're rooted to that, and it forms us, and what we were saying before about, consciousness and being in the world and stuff like that. We're very much formed by where we're from. And okay, so that's the thing. Heidegger's from Germany, he loves the forests of Germany and stuff like that. So tends to therefore talk about how it is to be a German, and, the greatest poetry in the world coincidentally happens to all to be German poetry, and all of those things. So in a sense, Heidegger is just going, okay, I've said this about rootedness. Now I'm going to explore the closest case of that, which is me. So that's that. But it then becomes an incredibly fine line between him saying that and stuff like, Hitler was saying that, Germans are the best, that we need to get rid of this cancer of the Jews, and we need to get rid of all these other races and so forth. And eventually everyone has to be German. And if you're non-German and you're in Germany, you have to die or get out. So some have argued that's just a coincidence of thinking between Heidegger and Hitler. Someone said it's an analogy, but it does make for some quite uncomfortable reading quite often. That and had Heidegger not joined the Nazi Party, and he did get out of the Nazi Party shortly after he joined, but for other reasons. But had he not done that, then I think those differences would be seen as more different. But the fact that he did those acts, it then becomes very, very uncomfortable. But I do think he's probably one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, and incredibly fascinating for those reasons. But difficult and uncomfortable, and it occasionally flares up. This whole question of Heidegger as Nazi, and it certainly affected Derrida's life. Derrida was seen as defending Heidegger, not 100% correctly, but and therefore deconstruction was also somehow involved with this. There is no truth sort of stuff. So so it's interesting.
Oh, I didn't know about that. Could you say more about that in terms of Derrida defending Heidegger?
Yeah, well, it was kind of an interesting dispute, and I think Derrida was a bit bruised by it. Basically Heidegger's journals and diaries and all letters and that sort of stuff were being constantly published in the 80s and 90s, and they got darker and darker. And there is some stuff it's called the Black Notebooks, the Black Books, where he basically says he hates Jews. And at a similar time, coincidentally, Derrida, who was influenced by Heidegger, as any continental philosopher was, had written a book called Of Spirit. And Of Spirit looks at the way that the word spirit is used in in Heidegger, particularly in the infamous speech that he gave at the university. So Heidegger, in Being and Time, doesn't use the word spirit. In fact, footnotes he's not going to. Now, spirit has always been an incredibly important word in German philosophy. Hegel is all about phenomenology of the spirit. So it's basically all of human existence is the journey of the spirit. So Heidegger deliberately doesn't mention this. However, in that speech, Heidegger uses the word spirit and he puts it back with a capital S, the German spirit. This is what we're doing. The German spirit is carrying on. Derrida has this lovely section where he talks about there's quotation marks around spirit in Being and Time, and then the quotation marks like theatre, like the curtains of theatre are lifted, and suddenly spirit is back. And so Derrida writes this. It happens to come out at exactly the same time as a book which just said Heidegger, which released all the information about Heidegger, not very much of it new, but really coherently in a book, saying Heidegger's a Nazi. If you defend Heidegger, then you're a Nazi or you're a Nazi sympathizer. And Derrida was really caught up in this. In fact, his book was a very slim volume on a very specific philosophical point. But he was just seen as a defender of Heidegger, which he wasn't. But it was thrown at him, and therefore, deconstruction was always having controversies around it, and this was one of the controversies around it. Obviously, here are these terrible people who say there's no truth, and obviously they do because they're Nazis. So
yeah. Oh wow. Oh, there's so I learn more and more all the time about all the different ways that deconstruction has been demonized.
Yeah, it has been in a lot of ways. Yeah, it's now blamed for CRT, which I know we're going to talk about another time, so we won't talk about now.
Yeah.
Different topic.
Yeah, that'll be exciting when you and Dusty and I talk about that. Yeah.
But we should just sort of touch there before we finish on Nietzsche and Nazism.
Yeah.
The other topic we wanted to cover, wasn't it? Nietzsche gets angry at most things. He gets angry at Christians. He gets angry at society. He gets angry at a whole bunch of stuff. And it's very deliberate and focused anger, and very witty anger. He also gets angry at Judaism. And what happened? And he gets angry at women. There's a lot of stuff in Nietzsche which, taken out of context, is pretty brutal. In fact, a fair bit of it in context, it can be quite brutal as well. So let's not just completely excuse Nietzsche on this. When he talks about things like the Superman, who would come and redeem the world. And unfortunately, his sister married Robert Forster, I think his name was. I may have got that wrong, so apologies to the whole Forster family if I have. So his sister marries a full-on Nazi, just absolutely no holds barred. And she kind of looks after him for those last 10 years when he's in the silent, but then very cultivates his image after that, including the big mistake. He never had but she very carefully, not carefully, but she does edit his work, and she pulls out full like that. It does not come in that too stronger. That's the sort of stuff she's grabbing out of it. Superman will come and all of this stuff, and I'm not sure Hitler ever had time to sit down and read. He may have. Certainly, this whole kind of German folk mythology built around Nietzsche as predicting the Nazis, as supporting the Nazis, to which Nietzsche would have been appalled. I mean, Nietzsche had tended toward the aristocratic. He tended to believe that dictatorship wasn't necessarily bad. Let's put it another way. He thought democracy was pretty crap because it let a load of idiots have a say, and he thought people were it. So he liked sort of a Greek style, or perhaps Roman, where there was an aristocratic class. You can get that out of Nietzsche.
Yeah, that can go all the way back to Socrates and Plato's Republic, and them talking about the tyranny of the majority in terms of democracy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you don't have to dig too deep into Nietzsche to get to some stuff that's going to support dictatorship and Nazism and Führers and so forth. As long as you ignore all the other stuff, Nietzsche would never have been "Let's kill all the Jews." I mean, he wrote,
of course,
as with every religion, he wrote critically. He thought there were great things about the religions, including Indian religions, which other philosophers hadn't written about, Islamic philosophies. Certainly not at that time; they hadn't written as much. So he found religion fascinating, and an opponent in many ways, but also was on the journey with him. So if what would happen was he'd have a few pages on religion, where he's saying Christianity is doing this wrong and Judaism's doing this wrong and Buddhism's doing this wrong and da 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 da. And obviously you can extract a bit which says Judaism's doing things wrong, or
Right.
and so which is essentially what happened.
Yeah.
And it did become perverted. And I don't think the fact that his name looks so much like the word Nazi as is completely helped his cause.
Yeah.
There is, I think, for a lot of people that this association was absolutely formed in their mind, that Nietzsche and
Yeah.
Nazi had some sort of real relationship.
And also, like, in terms of what you just said, in terms of him criticizing Christianity and Judaism, he also would do the similar type of thing, where he would criticize like all sides of things, and then people would assume that means he's only doing the things like he seemed to have this sense of German pride, kind of like you were talking about sometimes, but then he also at other times explicitly criticized German culture and things like that. And it reminds me too, there's this guy named, so I don't know if you've heard of him, because he's also like one of those intellectuals spreading misinformation about postmodernism. This guy named Stephen Hicks, who I think is a Ayn Randian objectivist.
Okay.
He wrote this book that I read called Nietzsche and the Nazis, and his whole thesis was that Nietzsche was a Nazi supporter, and he did all of that stuff. He did all of this cherry picking, and it's interesting. It's interesting too, because he also wrote this book called Explaining Postmodernism that Jordan Peterson, who we've talked about before, uses as what he says to say all the stuff, all the bullshit that he says about postmodernism. So Stephen Hicks has also been spreading misinformation about postmodernism.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, that sort of cherry picking thing. Just because you can reach into virtually anything and get out anything you want to, and Nietzsche doesn't help his cause, obviously, because he's a polemicist and and has very firm arguments against so much of the culture that was going on at the time. I mean, I think one of the fascinating things about Nietzsche, and I think it's gradually being more appreciated, was Nietzsche was a real universalist. Nietzsche, not universal as in everyone should be the same, but he knew his Chinese philosophy, he knew his Indian philosophy. He didn't sort of say Germany is better than them. In fact, he was very hard on German culture. He thought it had all gone to hell, to be honest. So incredibly powerful thinking and incredibly good thinking he respected and he promoted. If it was French, German, American, and so on, he would respect that. Some of his people who he does respect, you're very surprised by them, because you don't expect it. But it also not only pulls the words out of the context of Nietzsche, but often they're pulled out of the context of the time. And I think that's the other thing about any sort of cherry picking like that. To take Nietzsche on women, for instance, a lot of feminists have seen him as quite liberating, because he essentially says human nature is not fixed, so we can adjust it. But Nietzsche says some terrible things.
I didn't even know that, actually. I guess I had only heard maybe the more biased view of him being like really sexist against women.
Well, he is really sexist against women. There's some
it's like similar to the way he talks about other things, very sexist sometimes, but also like very supportive of women at other times.
Well, I think it's also more that that culture that we're talking about. Okay, so if you're a woman in 1880s Germany, you don't really have access to much education. You don't get to go to university. You don't get to go to school necessarily. At 15 or 16, you're off to sew stuff. And he was essentially saying, why are they being so dumb? What's going on? So you can take that women being dumb, or you're just going, this makes no sense. This it doesn't make any sense. So there's lots of different readings of Nietzsche, and particularly good feminist ones by people like Irigaray and what was it? Was it Kristeva wrote Marine Lover of Nietzsche? Because I mean, he's a complicated figure.
I should look into those. Could you after this send me those book and authors' names, and I'll look into seeing if I can find those?
Absolutely, because I mean, it is interesting, and I mean, again, I'll do a little bit of biography here. That Nietzsche was a complete failure with the ladies, basically, if I can use that term. He fell, as everyone who met her apparently did, fell for a woman called Luandeus Salome, who's an incredibly brilliant woman, and she's really worth looking into. And they sleep together? They may have slept together, and maybe he got syphilis from that. Maybe that was his madness. That was kind of the thing. But again, it's that weird thing with Nietzsche where he's if you want to analyze him, women are rebuffing him. He can't. He's awkward and shy and difficult, and finds it all difficult. And just as the way that society was awkward, he was awkward and shy, and therefore he's going back to his room and he's writing down his rage in many ways. But he's because it doesn't all fit together. The world isn't working. I sometimes think of him like when you're a teenager and there's all these rules around you, and it doesn't fit who you are. You're going, I'm not this person.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not. That's not actually who I am.
And you're and your hormones are raging, and you're around all these people you're sexually attracted to, and you're trying to figure out how the worldview that your parents gave to you is different from the ones that you're going to get from your peers as you eventually become an adult, and you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. And then you have to go to school, which sucks, and it makes education seem horrible. And there's so much stuff going on when you're a teenager.
Absolutely. And one of the things you think when you're that teenager is the world is insane. Because in many ways, it isn't. People are going to work every day for their lives and then dying. What's going on? Blah 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 blah. It's thoughts that we still have, of course. So I'm not saying Nietzsche is in any way adolescent in his thinking. But I'm just saying when he sits down to think, he is going from a perspective of the world is insane. Why are we not being educated? Why are endless history professors of philosophy just going natter and writing books about the same thing over and over again? Why are the passions being repressed? Why is Christianity, which was this puzzling thing, this huge system of building massive buildings and having massive rules and all that? He just thought the world was insane. And it drove him insane in the end because it couldn't make it fit with what he felt as a human being.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's it's true that when people are labeled as going insane for pointing out things like that in society, a lot of that, this reminds me too of postmodernists or post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida, like we've talked about before. I think about Foucault in particular talking about how this term insanity, he talks about this in detail in at least one or two of his books. This term insanity, it's just this label that was created by the modern institutions of science and psychiatry, and the DSM gets larger and larger and larger, so people are getting all of these new diagnoses are endlessly getting created. And he talks of, and I mention this example all the time because it's a really obvious one. The term homosexuality, he talks about how that was invented by the institutions of science and religion, and then religion declared homosexuality as sinful, and science declared homosexuality as a medical and psychological flaw. And even if you were even if straight people were even talking about anal sex or something, then that would mean that you as straight people were considered homosexual, even if you were not attracted to the same sex, because butt stuff makes you a homosexual.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, for Nietzsche, so for Foucault, society comes up with its categories to feed a particular sense of power. If you on one side of the line is madness, and one side of the line is sanity. On one side of the line is homosexuality. On the other side is normal heterosexuality. So it
Yeah. This false dichotomy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
was reading. I can't remember who it was, and I'm annoyed. I was just trying to think of it. A writer from the 50s, a female writer, who said something like, I think that throughout human history, there's been about as many good people and many bad people. There's been as many people sleeping with each other. There've been as many combinations of sexual partners going on throughout all of that entire time. All that changes is the categories. The categories keep changing. So, in Greek time, homosexuality was seen as normal and fine, and then later it wasn't, and now it is again. And so these categories keep changing. And what we need to do is look at why the categories keep changing. And Foucault would say, who does it suit? Who, and many others would say, who's signing the checks here? Who's making that decision? Who wants us to think that this is bad and this is good and this is sane and this is insane?
This is another area where it pisses me off when people talk about attach Foucault to all the like wokeness stuff, because I think that I really think that if you look at what he writes about, he talks about how people are creating all of these categories, and when you create these categories, it seeks to divide people and demonize them against each other. So I think he would probably be more of the mindset of, I don't care what your category's on, just do what you want to do. Don't let other people be trapped in your categories.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, woke is a fine example of this, isn't it? That a particular stream of society, if they want to not like something, they say that's woke. There's no kind of understanding.
It's the same. There's kind of like the same sort of spectrum associated with that. Like on one far end of the spectrum, if you're like an uber right winger, anything you don't like is like postmodern woke CRT. And then on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, anything you don't like is like racist, white supremacist, or something like that. And then people can have a lot of different definitions for all of these different terms too, and then they just assume that you know what their definition is.
Yeah. And the terrible thing about it, of course, is it's a way of shutting down an argument, shutting down discussion. And that's the base. Well, there's lots of terrible thing about it, because there's often violence associated with these categories and so forth. But one of the key things it does is it shuts down all discussion, doesn't it? If you say that's a woke opinion, then say someone says about something I believe in, then that is taking everything I've thought about it, everything I've discussed about it, everything, every nuance of that situation, and saying it's just that. And that's disempowering, apart from anything else, but also just is leading to a very angry world at the moment, I think. So
yeah. Like it's how and I know, like you said, we're gonna do a whole separate podcast about this, but it reminds me about what Dusty and I've been learning more and more about lately in reading about critical race theory, and seeing people going around saying things like critical race theory teaches kids to hate America, and and that white people should always feel guilty all the time, and you should hate white people. And then you go and read, just like with postmodernism, you go and read these books by the authors that people mention, like Kimberly Crenshaw or Derek Bell or countless others, and they don't sound anything like the way that they're described. They're not these like evil people trying to take down society and like demonize everyone. They're just trying to solve problems, and they're doing it in a particular way, which can be one part of a whole nuanced approach to approaching problems, but it can be one piece. And even like most critical race theorists don't think this is the only way to look at the world and this is the only way we should do this. Like all this stuff drives me crazy sometimes.
We will talk about this next time, because but I do sort of feel sorry for particularly some of the critical race theorists who have just been working very quietly for the last 30 years in a very small part of academia, doing this very gentle sort of look at how racial attitudes affect the way that we interact in the world, who are suddenly now the great devils of the world. And I think they're being horrified. Some of them must just be very surprised and just going, "What? Hang on, why weren't you listening 15 years ago when I was writing out a very small volume that everyone ignored?"
It's so crazy too. Like this category of wokeness is getting bigger and bigger all the time. Like I saw that you were tweeting about how Kant is being labeled as a critical race theorist now. Like Kant was a critical race theorist. Like how is that fucking possible?
It's That's insane. So everyone who's watching this should tune in for that next episode.
Yes.
We're going to end up now, but yeah, we're going to speak about that in a couple of weeks' time, I hope.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we can end it there if you want to, because you said about an hour would be good, and yeah, that's it. That is a good little preview for our next discussion that we're going to do with Dusty about critical race theory. Oh, someone said here, any reading or audiobook recommendations on Heidegger before the show ends? I would say if you don't want to get into his big magnum opuses, there's I think you can find it for free online. There's Heidegger's essay. I think it's just called something like on Nietzsche's Death of God. He wrote a really interesting essay about Nietzsche's Death of God. I can't recall any of his shorter works off the top of my head other than his magnum opus, Being in Time. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, a lot of the shorter stuff is late stuff, and I'm not so sure it's a good starting place. I do think Being in Time is very good. I mean, you have to read it very slowly. He does something that someone like Derrida doesn't do, which is when Heidegger is trying to introduce a new term, he will very slowly introduce it to you, and we'll explain it to you. But there's also, and I can't remember off the top of my head, I'll have to send it through to you. There is a podcast which I've been actually. It's going to be on my phone. If you can bear with me for 1 second, this is
no problem.
Episode. I think it's Simon Critchley doing Heidegger. Where is episodes? My library. This is.
Also, there's a philosopher named Greg Sadler who I like. He has a YouTube channel where he does deep dives into a lot of different specific texts from a lot of different philosophers.
Right.
His channel is very helpful. You can especially if you read a book and then you watch his video series on that particular book along with it, it helps a lot. Like he's doing one on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and I've been following that, and that helps along with like watching a bunch of lectures and reading stuff about Hegel to understand Hegel better.
Yeah, brilliant. This is it. I think it is Simon Critchley. And the reason it is Simon Critchley. The reason I can't remember is I hate the name of it. It's called Heidegger. Can you actually, if I hold it up there, Heidegger.
Heidegger.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But I've listened to 5 or 6 episodes of it, and it's very, very good. It really does start right at the start of Heidegger and start to follow his thoughts through. So, and Simon Critchley is very, very good. So, yeah, I'd go with Heidegger. Check it out.
There are lots of good lectures about Heidegger that you can find on YouTube too, from a whole bunch of like major universities and whole histories, and lots of people do podcasts. Like there's another podcast called Philosophize This, which just does half-hour episodes, and I'm sure there are some episodes about Heidegger. And check out what Greg Sadler has said about Heidegger on his YouTube channel too. I'm sure he's gone through like at least 1 or 2 of his books, and he does a great job of breaking down what a particular philosopher is talking about too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean Heidegger is hard to read, but he's also entertaining is the wrong word, but you do find yourself going into a different world, and that's always exciting, I think. So
yeah, he definitely has some fascinating ideas. So thanks a lot for talking with me, man. This was fun and interesting and educational as always. And looking forward to talking about critical race theory with Dusty. I guess do you want to do that next week or the week after that?
Yeah, that'd be great. Just let me know via the normal sources.
All right, cool. All right, so thanks everyone for watching. Click the like button. Thanks for the few comments there. Click the bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. Yes, check out an event perhaps, and the link for the Amazon page is in the description of the video there. And for something completely different on the weekend, on Friday, I'm going to be doing another podcast with Jared from the Wisecrack YouTube channel, formerly of the Wisecrack YouTube channel, who talked about philosophy and popular culture. We're going to talk about his favorite Nicolas Cage movie called Vampire's Kiss, which is where he gets bitten by a vampire and becomes one, or he maybe is just kind of hallucinating and thinking that he does. So we're going to talk about that movie. And yeah, so like I'll also check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description of the video there, as it always is. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And think about Dasein and Heidegger and Husserl and Nietzsche and all their interesting ideas and interesting philosophy in general. And yeah, anything else you want to say before we end it there?
Dasein is in the heart.
Dasein is in the heart. Yep.
Brilliant.
All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.
See you then. Bye.